It was a warm spring afternoon in the quiet town of Schönebeck, Germany, when the Gericke family decided to take a simple, wholesome walk through the nearby woods. The air was fresh, the birdsong echoed through the tall pines, and for 5-year-old Inga Gericke, it felt like a small adventure. She loved nature, chasing butterflies, and laughing as she picked little flowers along the forest path. That May Day in 2015 seemed like an ordinary family outing until, within a matter of minutes, it became every parent's nightmare. Somewhere between the sound of laughter and the crunch of leaves underfoot, Inga vanished without a trace. Her family called out her name, at first lightly, assuming she had run a few steps ahead. But soon their voices grew louder, their calls more frantic. Inga was gone. What began as a playful afternoon turned into a desperate search. The family combed through the area, shouting her name until their throats were raw. Within hours, authorities were contacted, and soon hundreds of volunteers and police officers joined in one of the largest search operations the region had ever seen. Dogs sniffed the ground, helicopters scanned from above, and divers explored ponds and streams. The woods, once a place of peace, became a haunting labyrinth of unanswered questions. How could a child simply disappear in broad daylight? As the days turned into weeks, the story of Inga's disappearance spread beyond Germany. The media began drawing parallels to another case that had shocked Europe years earlier, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. Both were young children who had seemingly vanished into thin air, both cases marked by silence where answers should have been. Headlines labeled, "Inga, the German Madeleine," amplifying the sense of dread and mystery that surrounded her case. Parents across the country clutched their children a little tighter, wondering how something so devastating could happen so close to home. Despite the massive search effort, there was no sign of Inga, no clothing, no footprints, no sound in the night. For her family, every day became an unbearable cycle of hope and heartbreak. They clung to the possibility that she might still be alive, that perhaps someone had taken her, and she would one day be found. Yet the lack of evidence was suffocating. Investigators chased countless leads, tips from supposed witnesses, rumors whispered in villages, and theories ranging from abduction to accident. Each lead seemed promising at first, but one by one, they all collapsed into nothing. The forest where Inga disappeared grew darker in the family's memory. It was no longer a place of fresh air and childhood laughter, but a living reminder of loss. Police continued their work interrogating suspects, revisiting the site, and even exploring links to known offenders in the area. But time, as it often does in such tragedies, became the enemy. Weeks faded into months, months into years, and still the silence remained. Inga's face, bright-eyed and smiling in every photo released by her family, stared back from posters and news reports. She became a symbol of unanswered questions, a reminder of how fragile safety could be, even in the most ordinary of moments. And then, years later, the forest spoke again. Deep within its silence, human remains were discovered, bones that had lain hidden beneath leaves and soil, waiting to be found. Tests confirmed the worst fears. They belonged to little Inga. What had once been hope was now grief carved in stone. But even with this grim discovery, the case refused to yield answers. How did she die? Who was responsible? Was it a tragic accident or something far darker? The discovery brought closure to one question, what had happened to Inga's body, but it opened the door to 1,000 more, each heavier than the last. The discovery of Inga's remains was supposed to be the turning point, the moment when questions would finally be answered. Yet, instead of clarity, it only deepened the mystery. The bones were found not far from the area where she had disappeared, in the same vast forest that had been searched so many times before. How could hundreds of officers, dogs, and helicopters have overlooked such evidence? That question haunted investigators as much as it haunted the public. Was the body there from the very beginning, hidden by the dense undergrowth? Or had someone returned to the woods later, deliberately placing the remains where they would eventually be found? Forensic teams worked tirelessly, analyzing every fragment, every trace of soil, every clue the bones might hold. But the results were frustratingly inconclusive. There were no clear signs of trauma, no definitive proof of foul play. It was as though the forest itself had swallowed the truth. Without answers, speculation grew louder. Some believed Inga had wandered deeper into the woods, perhaps fallen into a hidden ditch or succumbed to the elements. Others were convinced she had been abducted, and that the forest had been used as a final, cruel dumping ground. The German press kept the case alive, reporting every rumor, every whisper of new evidence. And soon the case took on a life of its own. Comparisons to Madeleine McCann intensified. Just like Madeleine, Inga had vanished in the middle of an ordinary day. Just like Madeleine, her disappearance drew massive international attention. And just like Madeleine, her case remained stubbornly unsolved. The haunting similarity fueled debates in cafes, homes, and police stations across Europe. How could children vanish so completely in societies surrounded by surveillance cameras, technology, and investigative resources? Investigators began to turn their attention toward possible suspects. Files were reopened on known criminals in the region, men with histories of violence, individuals with disturbing pasts. At one point, attention even fell on a notorious convicted pedophile whose property was near the forest. Police searched his land, dug up areas suspected of hiding secrets, and examined his history with excruciating detail. But once again, no direct connection to Inga was ever found. Each potential breakthrough dissolved into disappointment. The suspect lists grew long, but the evidence remained thin. For Inga's family, the torment was unbearable. Her parents lived between two worlds, one where they tried to maintain some sense of normality for their other children, and another where grief and questions consumed every waking moment. Each photograph of Inga became both a comfort and a dagger, a reminder of her smile and of the gaping void her absence had left behind. They became advocates for answers, pushing authorities not to give up, insisting that someone, somewhere, knew the truth. Meanwhile, the public narrative around the case turned almost mythical. The forest where Inga vanished became infamous, a symbol of fear and uncertainty. Journalists called it the German forest of silence. Residents of nearby villages spoke in hushed tones about what might have happened. To many, the case symbolized the vulnerability of innocence, a reminder that safety can be an illusion. The unanswered questions kept the story alive, ensuring it would not fade quietly into obscurity. And yet, amid the endless speculation, one truth remained unshakable. A 5-year-old girl had vanished on what should have been an ordinary family outing. Years later, all that was left were bones and mysteries, a silent puzzle that resisted every attempt at resolution. Even in death, Inga seemed to remain hidden, her story incomplete. For investigators, the case became a haunting echo of failure. For her family, it was a life permanently shattered. For the world, it was another reminder of how some of the darkest truths can remain forever out of reach. As the years passed, the disappearance of Inga Gericke became one of Germany's most infamous unsolved mysteries. Police files swelled with thousands of pages, witness statements, forensic reports, interviews, and speculative theories. Yet despite the massive effort, the answers always seemed just beyond reach. Each potential lead sparked a flicker of hope, only to extinguish into another dead end. For investigators, it was like chasing shadows in a maze with no exit. One of the most haunting aspects was the timing. Inga disappeared during daylight, surrounded by family and other people in the forest. There was no scream, no sound of struggle, no immediate sign of danger. How could a child vanish so quickly and silently? This chilling detail made investigators wonder if someone had been watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The possibility of a calculated abduction loomed large, though never confirmed. The case drew in specialists from across Germany, including profilers and child abduction experts. They studied every element of the scene. Some suggested Inga may have been lured away. Children are naturally trusting, especially when presented with something as simple as a toy, a puppy, or candy. Others argued the possibility of an accident, that she had wandered off and succumbed to the dangers of the woods, with her remains concealed by nature itself. But the discovery of her bones years later muddied the waters. If it had been a mere accident, why hadn't her remains been found during the exhaustive initial searches? As theories multiplied, so did the emotional toll. The Gericke family faced relentless media scrutiny. Every public statement was analyzed, every photo dissected. They were thrust into a cruel spotlight, forced to grieve while strangers speculated about their private lives. Some reporters even hinted at family involvement, echoing the cruel suspicions once directed at the McCanns. For grieving parents, this was salt on an already raw wound. They had lost their daughter, and now they were battling public judgment as well. Meanwhile, the forest itself became a symbol. People visited the area where Inga disappeared, leaving flowers, toys, and notes in her memory. It turned into a place of mourning, but also of eerie fascination, where tragedy had intersected with mystery. Locals often described walking there as unsettling, as though the trees themselves carried secrets that would never be revealed. Years later, when her bones were finally discovered, the forensic silence they carried was almost unbearable. Scientists could not determine a cause of death. There were no clear injuries, no weapon marks, no evidence pointing definitively to foul play. The lack of answers frustrated both investigators and the public. It was as if the truth had been carefully erased, leaving only fragments that refused to align into a complete picture. Still, detectives pressed on. They revisited old suspects, scoured phone records, and reconstructed every timeline from that day in 2015. They even consulted international experts, hoping that an outside perspective might shed light where local efforts had failed. But nothing broke the silence. The case remained suspended in limbo, a haunting balance between accident and crime, between closure and eternal doubt. For the world, Inga's story became a cautionary tale. Parents repeated her name to their children, communities used her case as a reminder of vigilance, and journalists revisited the details on anniversaries, ensuring the story never fully disappeared. She had become a symbol of unanswered questions, of innocence stolen not just by death, but by mystery itself. By the time investigators acknowledged the dead ends, the case had taken on a second life, one built almost entirely from speculation and public imagination. Every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, news outlets revived the story, always with the same painful photographs. Inga's smiling face, her blonde hair framing innocent eyes, a child frozen in time. She would have been a teenager by then, but the world only knew her as the 5-year-old who vanished in the woods. This strange stasis added to the tragedy. She was never allowed to grow, to change, to live beyond that single moment in May 2015. In the absence of solid answers, rumors spread like wildfire. Some believed Inga had been abducted by a stranger passing through the region, possibly someone involved in organized crimes of child exploitation. Others whispered darker theories that perhaps she had been taken by someone within the local community, hidden in plain sight. These theories, though chilling, persisted because the investigation never produced conclusive proof to silence them. Each theory reflected the human need to make sense of the senseless, to stitch together fragments of fear into some kind of narrative. The forest itself became more than a location. It became a character in the story. People described it as vast, unpredictable, and almost alive with secrets. For many, it symbolized how nature can conceal both beauty and horror. Journalists often drew parallels with old European folklore, forests as places of disappearance, of children wandering too far, of evil lurking between the trees. The imagery resonated deeply with the public, transforming Inga's case into something that felt almost archetypal. She was no longer just a girl lost. She was the embodiment of every parent's worst nightmare, every whispered, cautionary tale. Meanwhile, police resources continued to be drained by the ongoing investigation. Dozens of officers, analysts, and specialists poured years of effort into the search for answers, yet every breakthrough turned hollow. The frustration was so intense that the case was compared to a bottomless well. Every attempt to reach the truth only pulled investigators deeper into darkness. Even politicians began referencing it, using Inga's story to call for stronger child protection laws and more advanced investigative techniques. Her name had become a rallying cry, even as her mystery remained untouched. For the Guerrica family, life became divided into before and after. They tried to maintain routines for their other children, but grief seeped into every corner of their existence. Birthdays became reminders of absence. Holidays became rituals of mourning. Every anniversary of her disappearance was both a wound reopened and a plea for answers. Despite their pain, they never stopped fighting for justice, speaking publicly in the hope that someone, somewhere, might come forward with the missing piece of the puzzle. Yet the silence endured. The case began to feel cursed, not only because of the lack of evidence, but because every attempt to force an answer seemed to lead investigators further away. It became a chilling symbol of how, even in modern times with technology, science, and resources, some truths remain hidden. Inga's story was no longer just about one girl. It was about the terrifying possibility that some mysteries are destined never to be solved. Years after Inga's disappearance, a chilling discovery reignited public interest in the case, the revelation that her bones had been hidden in the very same forest where she had vanished. The discovery should have been the missing piece of the puzzle, but instead it raised more questions than it answered. How could such a massive search operation, with helicopters, trained dogs, divers, and hundreds of volunteers, have failed to locate her? Was it possible that her remains had been placed there later, deliberately concealed until time had passed, and crucial evidence had faded? This theory terrified many, suggesting the presence of a calculating mind behind her fate. The forensic analysis provided little comfort. No clear signs of violence, no evidence of sexual assault, and no definitive cause of death were identified. The bones were mute, refusing to reveal the story of Inga's final moments. The absence of answers opened the door to even darker speculation. Had she fallen victim to a predator who knew how to erase every trace? Or was this a tragic accident, her tiny body hidden too well by the dense layers of the forest until nature itself returned her remains? As investigators revisited suspects, attention turned toward known offenders in the region. One man, notorious for his criminal history, became the subject of intense investigation. His property was searched, excavations were conducted, and his connections scrutinized. For a moment, the public believed the breakthrough had finally come. Yet, as had happened so many times before, no solid link to Inga was ever proven. The frustration was suffocating, both for the authorities and for the grieving family who had pinned their hopes on justice. The comparisons to Madeleine McCann grew even louder during this period. Just as with Madeleine, the lack of evidence made the story feel like a riddle written in smoke. The media thrived on the parallels. 2 innocent children, 2 sudden vanishings, 2 investigations that seemed to chase ghosts. Inga was often called Germany's Madeleine, a title that both kept her memory alive and deepened the pain of her parents, who knew their daughter was more than a symbol. She was a child with favorite toys, with a laugh that echoed in their home, with dreams that would never be realized. Meanwhile, the community around Schönebeck lived under a shadow. Parents grew fearful of letting their children play unsupervised, and the forest, once a place of peace, became tainted with suspicion. Stories spread, and locals whispered about strangers who had been seen in the area, about secrets that perhaps the community had ignored. The silence of the woods became unbearable, a constant reminder of the unanswered questions lingering over the case. For the Gericke family, grief had taken on a cruel rhythm. Each time investigators announced a new lead, hope would rise, only to be shattered again by the absence of results. They lived in a limbo, where mourning was incomplete because justice remained elusive. Inga's image on posters, in documentaries, and on anniversary reports became both a comfort and a torment. The world had not forgotten her, but remembering without answers was its own form of suffering. The haunting truth was that Inga's story had escaped the boundaries of a single tragedy. It had become something larger, something symbolic. She represented every child who had ever vanished, every family left with more questions than answers, every parent who lay awake at night wondering if safety was ever real. And as long as her case remained unsolved, that shadow would never lift. By the 6th year after Inga's disappearance, the case had already cemented itself as one of Germany's darkest mysteries. Police officers who had once been fresh recruits were now seasoned veterans, yet the file on Inga's case remained stubbornly thick and unresolved. Inside it were timelines, maps, photographs of the forest, detailed witness interviews, and long lists of suspects, all of which painted a picture of tireless effort but yielded no resolution. To the outside world, it seemed impossible. How could a case with so much attention, so many resources, and so many investigators remain trapped in silence? The lack of closure gave rise to conspiracy theories. Some believed there had been a cover-up, that perhaps key evidence had been mishandled or even deliberately hidden. Others suspected organized crime, whispering that Inga might have been targeted by networks far beyond her quiet hometown. Though these theories often lacked evidence, they thrived in the void left by unanswered questions. Every gap in the story became a fertile ground for speculation. The media amplified these theories, not because they were proven, but because the public demanded explanations for the inexplicable. The forest continued to loom large in the narrative, becoming almost mythical in its role. People described it as endless, though in reality it was not. What it truly was, however, was dense and disorienting, the kind of place where paths split and the sense of direction slipped away. Parents who once encouraged their children to explore nature now held them closer, warning them not to stray even a few steps. The memory of Inga had transformed the woods into a space of fear, the embodiment of every nightmare about what could happen when a child wandered too far. Authorities did not abandon the case. Periodically, they reopened searches, dug in new areas, and reanalyzed the bones for forensic breakthroughs as technology advanced. Each attempt was accompanied by press conferences and renewed hope, but each one ended in disappointment. The bones, fragile and silent, revealed no DNA traces of another person, no fingerprints, no fibers, nothing to identify who, if anyone, had been with her in those final moments. Science could not tell the story her family longed to hear. For the Gericke family, life became a cruel balancing act between remembering and trying to move forward. Inga's room, filled with toys and childhood drawings, became a shrine to her memory. Birthdays were marked by tears instead of laughter, her absence amplified by the milestones she would never reach. Yet they remained determined to fight, demanding that the case not be closed, refusing to let their daughter fade into history as just another unsolved disappearance. Documentaries and true crime programs continued to spotlight Inga's story. Her case became a subject for debate among criminologists, psychologists, and journalists who tried to piece together scenarios. Was it an abduction carried out by someone skilled enough to erase every trace? Or a tragic accident, her body hidden by chance in a way that escaped the eyes of hundreds of searchers? The inability to choose between these options was what kept the story alive. The dreadful uncertainty of not knowing. Inga's legacy had become paradoxical. She was both a symbol of innocence lost and a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest mysteries, people would not stop searching for truth. Her story was no longer confined to Germany. It was discussed internationally, her name echoing in conversations about missing children across Europe. And yet, at its heart, it remained heartbreakingly simple. A family had lost their little girl, and no one could explain why. In the years that followed, the image of Inga Gericke continued to appear across newspapers, documentaries, and online forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries. Each time her face was shown, the same haunting question resurfaced. How could a child vanish in the presence of family, during daylight in a forest combed by hundreds, only to reappear years later as silent bones? That unresolved tension made her story linger in the minds of millions long after other headlines had faded. Investigators, desperate for progress, leaned on advancing technology. They tested soil samples again, scanned the bones with new forensic methods, and reopened databases in the hope of finding DNA matches or overlooked connections. Yet even with the most modern tools, the evidence remained stubbornly mute. There were no signs of violence that could be classified as murder, nor were there indicators of a purely natural death. It was a paradox that frustrated scientists and detectives alike. Too much mystery to close the case, but too little evidence to solve it. Attention turned once more to possible human involvement. Detectives interviewed former convicts, re-examined known predators in the area, and re-questioned witnesses whose stories might have shifted over time. One man, whose property had been searched before, became the focus of renewed suspicion. But like every other lead, it crumbled without proof. Authorities were left chasing ghosts, and the Gericke family was left clinging to hope that someone, someday, would step forward with the missing truth. For the community, Inga's story became folklore. Parents told their children not to stray in the forest, invoking her name as a warning. Villagers whispered about strangers they remembered seeing that day, details blurred by time but repeated as though they might hold hidden meaning. The forest paths where she vanished were no longer just dirt and trees. They were etched into memory as the stage of a tragedy that no one could forget. The media's role was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, constant coverage kept Inga's story alive, ensuring she was never forgotten. On the other, the comparisons to Madeleine McCann turned the family's grief into a spectacle. They wanted justice, not sensationalism. They wanted their daughter to be remembered as Inga, not just Germany's Madeleine. And yet, the connection was inescapable. Both cases symbolized the same horror, that a child could simply vanish, and that the truth might never be found. For her parents, every passing year was another battle. They lived with milestones that would never be reached: the first day of school, the teenage years, the dreams of adulthood. They had only memories of her laughter, the sound of her running through the garden, the way she held their hands. Grief became part of their identity, shaping every aspect of their lives. And though the discovery of her bones had closed the door on one possibility, it opened a darker one, that someone had taken her life and would never face justice. By this point, Inga's case had evolved from a local tragedy into a national mirror. It reflected not only the fragility of childhood, but also the flaws of human systems, how even with all the tools of modern investigation, some mysteries resisted solution. And in that resistance lay the most chilling truth of all. Sometimes, Evil hides not in what we can see, but in what remains forever invisible. In the end, the tragedy of Inga Gericke became less about answers and more about the haunting absence of them. Her story was carved into the collective memory of Germany, not because of what was known, but because of what remained unknowable. For her family, the years had passed like shadows, each one marked by anniversaries, each one spent in the relentless search for meaning where there was none to be found. The discovery of her bones had given them a place to grieve, but it had not given them peace. Closure was denied to them, withheld by the silence of the forest that had swallowed their daughter's last moments. To this day, no one has been held accountable for Inga's death. The police files remain open, growing heavier with each year that passes, a symbol of determination but also of failure. Investigators have come and gone, each inheriting the same impossible puzzle. Theories still abound: an accident lost in the chaos of the search, an abduction carried out with surgical precision, a crime so carefully concealed that even modern forensic science could not untangle it. None of these theories have been proven, none have been dismissed. The truth remains suspended, hovering somewhere between possibility and myth. The comparisons to Madeleine McCann endure, not because the stories are identical, but because they tap into the same primal fear, the vulnerability of children, and the terrifying speed with which safety can shatter. For many, Inga's story stands as a reminder that disappearance is not something that only happens in faraway places. It can happen in the heart of familiar woods, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, in the space between laughter and silence. Over time, Inga's case became something larger than crime. It became a story told to remind communities of vigilance, a case studied in law enforcement circles as an example of how mysteries can defy even the most relentless pursuit. For families who had lost children under similar circumstances, Inga became a symbol of solidarity, her name echoing in their own grief. She was no longer just a little girl from Schönebeck. She was every child who had ever disappeared, every parent who had ever faced the unbearable. And yet, in the middle of the headlines, the documentaries, the comparisons, and the theories, it is important to remember who Inga really was. She was a child with favorite games, with a laugh that filled her home, with tiny footsteps that echoed through her family's garden. She was a daughter, a sister, a granddaughter, her life full of potential, her future stolen far too soon. The tragedy of her story is not only that her disappearance remains unsolved, but that her voice was silenced before it could grow. The final chilling truth of Inga's case is that some mysteries may never be solved. Some stories are destined to remain unfinished, leaving behind echoes instead of answers. The forest where she vanished still stands, quiet and indifferent, a place that holds secrets no one has yet been able to uncover. And as long as the truth remains hidden, Inga's story will continue to live in the minds of those who hear it, a haunting reminder of innocence lost, of questions without answers, and of how a little girl vanished, leaving behind only silence.